The Stranger at Blackberry Inn, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Man Who Asked Too Many Questions. The storm had been threatening Pentreth-on-Sea for 3 days before it finally broke, and when it did, it brought with it a stranger no one in the village had invited. Blackberry Inn stood at the crook of the coastal road, where the land dipped down toward the harbour and the old stone bridge crossed the mill stream before it lost itself in the sea. It was October of 1952, and the gorse on the headland had gone the colour of rust, and the wind off the Atlantic carried salt and the threat of worse weather to come. Thomas Pendarves, who had kept the inn for 11 years, was standing behind the bar polishing glasses that did not need polishing when the door blew open and a man came in shaking rain from his coat, like a dog shaking off a river. "I telephoned ahead," the man said, by way of introduction. "Renshaw. Victor Renshaw. I believe you have a room." He was perhaps 50, though it was difficult to say with certainty, one of those faces that might have been hardened by either age or experience, the eyes pale and watchful above a moustache gone grey at the edges. His clothes were good but not new, the kind of well-cut tweed that had been relined once or twice to extend its usefulness, the cuffs a shade darker than the rest where they had been turned. He carried a single battered case, its leather cracked at the corners, and an umbrella he had clearly not thought to open in time, so that water still dripped steadily from the brim of his hat onto the flagstones. "That we do, sir," said Thomas, setting down his cloth. "Room above the snug. Quietest in the house, my wife always says, though I can't speak to the truth of that myself, not having slept in it. Will you be wanting supper, Mr. Renshaw? My wife's done a pie." "Supper would be very welcome," said Renshaw, and there was something in the careful, measured way he spoke, as though each sentence had been weighed before it was permitted to leave him, that struck Thomas as faintly odd, though he could not have said precisely why. Renshaw signed the register in a hand so small and cramped that Thomas, glancing at it later, found he could barely make out the man's own name, the letters huddled together like people sheltering from rain. "Business in these parts, sir, or pleasure?" Thomas asked, more from habit than any real curiosity, as he led the way up the narrow stair. Renshaw paused on the landing, his case still in hand. "A little of both, perhaps. I have an interest in local history. Old families, old records, that sort of thing. A man finds it a soothing occupation in his later years. Plenty of old families round here, sir, that's certain. Been some of them here longer than the church itself, or so they like to claim." "So I have heard," said Renshaw, and something in his pale eyes, just for a moment, seemed to sharpen with an interest that had nothing whatsoever to do with soothing occupations. It was Beatrice Pendarves, however, who first remarked, quietly, to her daughter Rosalind, in the kitchen that evening, over the steam of the supper she was plating, that there was something not quite right about their new guest. "He's been asking after the Truins," she said, ladling stew into bowls with more force than the task required, "and the Reverend, and old Mrs. Pencarrow up at the house. Not in any natural way, mind. Not like a man making conversation over his pint. Like a man taking inventory. Wrote things down in a little notebook, he did, while he ate, when he thought I wasn't looking." Rosalind, who was 23, and had her father's dark hair and her mother's sharp eye for the odd detail, looked up from the bread she was slicing, the knife pausing mid-stroke. "Taking inventory of what, mother?" "That," said Beatrice, setting the ladle down with a clatter, "is precisely what I should like to know. A man doesn't come all this way, in October, with the roads half flooded, just to look at old church registers. There's something he's hunting for. I can smell it on him the way you can smell rain coming." "Perhaps he's only lonely," Rosalind offered, though without much conviction. "Some old men get that way. Collect facts about other people's families because they haven't much of their own left to think about." "Perhaps," said Beatrice, in a tone that made plain she believed nothing of the kind, and carried the bowls through to the dining room, where Renshaw sat alone at the table by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass with an attention that seemed, somehow, to belong to the room behind him rather than the weather in front of it. It was Miss Jane Marple, staying at the time with her niece Mrs. Diana Whitcomb in the pretty cottage behind the church, ostensibly to recover from a winter chill, and rather more honestly because Pentreth-on-Sea was reputed to have the finest sea air in Cornwall, who first encountered Mr. Renshaw properly on the Thursday in the queue at the post office. He was asking the postmistress, in a voice pitched just low enough to seem confidential, and just loud enough to be overheard by anyone with the patience to listen, whether the village had kept its parish records intact through the war. "So many places lost things in the bombing," he said, leaning slightly over the counter. "Even out here, one imagines, with the coast so exposed." "We were never bombed, sir," said the postmistress, Mrs. Hannaford, a little stiffly, drawing herself up with the particular pride of a woman whose village had survived a war intact. "Not so much as a scratch on the church roof, and the Lord be thanked for it." "How fortunate," said Renshaw, and there was something in the way he said it, not quite disappointment, but something adjacent to it, the flat note of a man recalculating an equation that had not come out quite as he'd hoped, that made Miss Marple, waiting behind him with a parcel for her sister, tilt her head very slightly, the way a bird does when it hears something in the hedge that the rest of the garden has not yet noticed. She said nothing. She rarely did, at first. It was, she had long ago discovered, very much more productive to listen than to speak, particularly in the early stages of acquaintance with a stranger whose purposes had not yet declared themselves. But that evening, over sherry with her niece in the small, warm sitting-room of the cottage, with the fire crackling and the rain still tapping at the windows, she remarked, apropos of very little, that there was something curiously purposeful about the new guest at the inn. "The sort of man, my dear, who has come to a place not to rest, but to find something, or someone. A man on a private errand, I should think, though what manner of errand I cannot yet say." Diana laughed and said her aunt saw mysteries in the bottom of every teacup, and reached over to refill her glass. "You said much the same thing about the new curate at Meddenham 3 summers ago, and he turned out to be nothing more sinister than a man who collected stamps and was shy of confessing it." "That is quite true," Miss Marple agreed placidly, "and I was very glad to be wrong about him. I am not always right, Diana. I am only, I think, rather more inclined than most people to notice when something does not quite fit the shape of its surroundings. And Mr. Renshaw, I confess, does not fit the shape of Pentreth-on-Sea at all. He fits the shape of something else entirely, though I could not yet tell you what." And with that she smiled, and let the matter rest, for the present. Chapter 2. The Harvest Fair. The village held its harvest fair on the green by St. Petrock's Church every year on the last Saturday of October, rain or shine. And this year it was, against all expectation, shine, a hard, bright autumn sun that turned the wet grass to silver and brought out half the parish in their good coats, scarves wound tight against a wind that still carried the storm's chill 3 days on. There were stalls of bramble jam and knitted things, and a tombola run by the Women's Institute with a prize pig that everyone privately suspected belonged, in spirit if not in law, to whichever family won it most often, since old Sam Pascoe had carried it home 4 years running and showed no inclination to let the streak end. Children ran shrieking between the stalls with toffee apples. A brass band from the next parish played, somewhat flatly, in the bandstand, and the smell of wood smoke and cider and crushed grass hung over the whole green like a benediction. The Reverend Hugh Tremaine, a tall, stooped man with kind, tired eyes, presided over the whole affair with the harried good humour of a man who had organised this same fair for 15 years and never once managed to make the bunting hang straight. He moved from stall to stall with a word for everyone, a coin for the tombola, a steadying hand on the shoulder of any child who looked likely to knock over the jam. Victor Renshaw attended. This in itself surprised no one. A guest at the inn naturally went where there was entertainment to be had. But what struck several observers, in hindsight, was whom he sought out, and with what particular, deliberate patience he sought them. He spent a full 20 minutes in conversation with Dr. Alistair Conway, the village's physician, a brisk, sandy-haired man, not yet 40, who had taken over the practice from his predecessor some 6 years before. Miss Marple, sitting on a bench near the cake stall with a cup of tea she had no great urgency to finish, observed that Dr. Conway's easy professional smile had, by the end of the conversation, become something rather more fixed, the corners of it pulled tight, as though held in place by an act of will rather than any genuine pleasure. "Lovely afternoon for it," she heard Dr. Conway say, a touch too heartily, as the two men parted, and Renshaw's answering smile carried in it something that was not quite agreement. Later, Renshaw approached Mrs. Clarissa Pencarrow, the widow who occupied the big grey house on the headland, and who was, by common consent, the wealthiest woman in the parish, and the least inclined to discuss her affairs with strangers. Whatever he said to her caused her to go quite pale beneath her rouge, her gloved hand rising briefly to her throat, and excuse herself rather more abruptly than courtesy strictly required, leaving Renshaw standing alone by the skittles with an expression Miss Marple could only describe, later, as that of a man who has confirmed something he had hoped, against reason, might prove untrue. And then there was the matter of Caleb Trewin. Caleb was a fisherman, 30 or so, broad-shouldered and weathered, who had come back from the war with a limp and very little patience for conversation of any kind beyond what his trade required. He was standing near the skittles with his sister Morwenna when Renshaw approached him, and what passed between the two men was brief, no more than a minute, but it ended with Caleb's hand closing hard around Renshaw's wrist, and a few words spoken low enough that no one nearby could make them out, though several people saw them, and would later disagree, with surprising vehemence, about precisely what they had seen. "He looked," said Morwenna Trewin afterward, to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying the particular relish of a woman with a good story to tell, as if he wanted to throw the man into the mill-pond there and then. White as a sheet, Caleb was, and shaking with it. It was an unfortunate thing to say, considering what came after. Miss Marple, who had seen the exchange from her bench, though not heard it, filed it away with the same quiet attention she gave to everything, the woman who always overwatered her geraniums and never once noticed her roses suffering for the neglect, the vicar who never quite met one's eyes when discussing the church accounts, though he was scrupulously honest in every figure, the particular silence of a person who has just been asked a question they did not wish to answer, a silence with a different texture entirely from the silence of a person who simply has nothing to say. Human nature, she had long ago concluded, was remarkably consistent in its inconsistencies, and a village fair was as good a place as any to observe it laid bare in all its small, telling gestures. By 4 o'clock the light was already beginning to fail, in the way it does in late October, the sun dropping fast behind the church tower, and the wind picking up off the sea with a new and colder edge. The fair began its slow dissolution into knots of people drifting homeward with jam jars and raffle prizes, the bandstand falling silent, the stall-holders beginning to pack away their wares. Renshaw was seen, by the postmistress, and again by young Tommy Pencarrow, the gardener's boy, walking alone down the lane that led past the mill, his coat collar turned up against the evening chill, in the direction of the mill pond behind Blackberry Inn. He was not seen alive again. Chapter 3. The Mill Pond. It was Thomas Pendarves himself who found him, a little after 8 that evening, when Renshaw had failed to come down for his supper, and the innkeeper, more from professional duty than any real alarm, had gone out with a lantern to see whether the gentleman had perhaps gone for an evening walk and lost track of the hour, as visitors unfamiliar with the swiftness of a Cornish autumn dusk so often did. The mill pond lay behind the inn's kitchen garden, fed by the same stream that turned the old water wheel, long disused now, the wheel itself gone green with moss. But the pond remained, deep and dark and edged with reeds that in October had gone the colour of old rope, bending now under the rising wind. Thomas saw the shape in the water before he properly understood what he was seeing, and it took him a long, frozen moment, lantern shaking in his hand so that the light jumped and skittered across the black surface, before the shape resolved itself into a man face down among the reeds, his good tweed coat billowing dark around him, like a stain spreading through water. "Beatrice!" His voice came out cracked and strange, hardly his own. "Beatrice, fetch Davy Polkinghorne, and quick about it." The village constable, a steady, unimaginative young man named Davy Polkinghorne, was summoned, and after him Dr. Conway, who confirmed what was by then obvious to everyone gathered with lanterns at the pond's edge, that Victor Renshaw was dead, and had likely been dead some hours. "Drowned," said Dr. Conway, crouching by the pond's edge in the lamplight, his face carefully composed, professional, giving nothing away beyond what the examination strictly required. "Looks straightforward enough. The path along here is treacherous after rain. There's a drop of a good 4 feet from the bank, and no rail. He'd have struck his head, like as not, against that stone there, and gone under before he knew what was happening. A man unfamiliar with the ground, in failing light. It's the sort of accident that's happened before in this county, and will happen again, I shouldn't wonder, until somebody sees fit to put up a proper rail." It was, on the face of it, a perfectly reasonable explanation. The path was treacherous. The bank was unguarded, a long-standing complaint of Beatrice Pendarvs's, who had asked her husband twice to see about a rail, and been told twice that there was no money for it this year, what with the new boiler and the roof besides. A stranger, unfamiliar with the ground, walking alone in failing light after a day of drink and excitement at the fair. It wanted no great imagination to picture how such a man might lose his footing on the wet stone and go down into water that closed over him cold and silent and final. And yet, Miss Marple, who had been informed of the tragedy the following morning by her niece over the breakfast table, for such news travelled through a village like Pentrith-on-Sea, with the speed and thoroughness of the tide coming in, reaching every cottage before the milk had properly been delivered, found herself troubled by a detail that seemed, to everyone else, entirely beside the point. "He had no hat," she said, buttering her toast with great precision. Diana looked up from her own breakfast, startled. "I beg your pardon, Aunt Jane. Mr. Renshaw. When he left the fair yesterday, Tommy Pencarrow saw him with his coat collar up, a man minding the cold, you understand, the gesture of someone who feels the wind keenly. And yet this morning, Constable Polkinghorne tells me there was no hat found near the pond, nor anywhere along the path between the green and the mill. A man careful enough to turn up his collar against an October evening is not, in my experience, a man who goes out bareheaded in the first place, nor a man whose hat simply vanishes without a trace. Perhaps it blew off in the wind and was carried into the mill stream," said Diana, reasonably enough. "It was blowing hard enough by evening." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, in the tone of a woman who did not for one moment believe it, "though the stream runs the other direction entirely from where the body was found. And a hat, my dear, does not generally swim upstream to drown its owner before vanishing downstream afterward. It is, I grant you, a very small thing, but small things, in my experience, are so very often the only things that refuse to fit the story everyone else has already agreed to believe." Chapter 4. A Torn Letter. The inquest was held 3 days later in the village hall, and returned, as such things in small communities so often do, a verdict that satisfied everyone's desire for the matter to be quickly and tidily closed. Death by misadventure. Dr. Conway gave his evidence with brisk professional confidence, Constable Polkinghorne described the treacherous state of the bank, the absence of any rail, the loose stone he had himself identified near the water's edge with what might have been a fresh chip in it, though he could not swear to when the chip had occurred. Thomas Pendarves, white-faced and still rather shaken, described finding the body. No one mentioned the hat, because no one but Miss Marple had thought to wonder about it, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly at the back of the hall, did not think the inquest the proper forum in which to raise so small and uncertain a point. It was Rosalind Pendarves, clearing out the dead man's room 2 days after the inquest. For the inn, after all, could not keep a room indefinitely given over to a guest who would never again require it, and there was already a commercial traveller written to ask after vacancies, who found the letter. It had fallen, or been pushed, behind the small writing desk under the window, wedged into the gap where the desk's leg had warped slightly away from the wall, and might have remained there for years had Rosalind not been thorough in her sweeping, on her knees with a dustpan, when her fingers brushed paper where no paper ought to have been. It was torn, not cleanly, but as though it had been ripped in a hurry, or in anger, leaving only the lower half of a single page, the top portion gone entirely, perhaps burnt in the small grate, for there were ashes there too, though too far disintegrated to tell. The handwriting was Renshaw's own cramped hand, evidently a draft of a letter he had been composing and then abandoned, or destroyed in part and forgotten the rest. And so I must conclude that my suspicions, formed these 18 months past, are now beyond reasonable doubt. The man who calls himself, here the tear cut across the page, taking with it whatever name had followed, the paper's edge ragged and final, has built an entire life upon a foundation that will not survive close examination. I do not say this lightly, nor without sympathy for what the war made necessary for so many good men, broken in ways their countrymen will never fully understand. But there is a difference, as you well know, between a man who survived and a man who has, for 7 years now, occupied another's name, another's modest fortune, and, I begin to fear, another's very identity, while the true, the tear took this too, remains, so far as the records show, officially deceased, his grave unmarked, his family never informed of the truth they deserve, however painful that truth may prove. I intend to confront him directly upon my return from Cornwall, and I should be grateful for your counsel as to whether the authorities ought to be informed before or after this conversation takes. The letter ended there, unsigned, unaddressed, its recipient as much a mystery as the man whose secret it threatened to expose. Rosalind, sensibly, did not attempt to interpret it herself, though her hands trembled a little as she smoothed the torn page flat upon the desk. She brought it straight to Miss Marple, whom her mother had once described, not entirely approvingly, for Beatrice Pendarves had old-fashioned views about the propriety of elderly ladies who took such evident interest in other people's business, as a woman who notices things, and who Rosalind privately suspected might be rather better at noticing things than the entire county constabulary combined, Constable Polkinghorne very much included. Miss Marple read the fragment twice, very slowly, by the window of Diana's sitting room, while the autumn light moved across the paper and the fire settled in the grate behind her. "Well," she said at last, folding it with great care along its existing creases, "it would seem, my dear, that Mr. Renshaw did not come to Pentreth-on-Sea to write about folklore at all. He came hunting for a man who is not who he claims to be, a man, moreover, who has been living a stolen life for some 7 years, while the man whose life it rightfully was lies forgotten, his family uninformed, his grave, if he has one at all, unmarked and unmourned. That is no small matter, Rosalind. That is the sort of secret a person might do a very great deal to protect." Chapter 5. The Village Theorises. News of the torn letter, for such news could no more be contained than the tide, spread through the village within a day, gathering embellishments as it went. until by Wednesday it was being said, with great confidence by several parties who had no actual knowledge of the document's contents, that Victor Renshaw had been a private investigator, a blackmailer, a bigamist hunting his own runaway wife, or possibly all three at once, depending on who was doing the telling and how many pints had accompanied the telling. At the Anchor public house, where the men of the village gathered of an evening, the theories ran thick as the smoke that hung blue and heavy beneath the low-beamed ceiling. "Stands to reason," said old Sam Pascoe, who had fished these waters for 60 years and considered himself an authority on most matters by right of longevity, setting down his tankard with the air of a man delivering settled wisdom. "Stranger comes asking questions, stranger ends up dead. He'd found something out about someone, and someone didn't care to have it found. Always the way of it. I seen it before, mind, back in my father's day when—" "Found out what, though?" interrupted another, less inclined to sit through one of Sam's Father's Day stories. "Is the question, isn't it? Can't go round suspecting every soul in the parish on the strength of half a torn letter nobody's properly read but Miss Marple and the Pendarves girl. But suspect they did, and inevitably, given the events of the Harvest Fair, suspicion settled most heavily and most unfairly upon Caleb Trewin, whose altercation with the dead man had been witnessed by half the green, and was now repeated with steadily increasing drama at every retelling, until in some versions Caleb had struck the man outright, and in others he had been heard, quite distinctly, threatening murder. Constable Polkinghorne, under pressure from his superiors in Truro, who took a dim view of unexplained deaths going unexplained for very long once an inquest had returned a verdict that the local newspaper, at least, seemed disinclined to accept without further comment, called Caleb in for questioning on the Thursday. "He was asking after my father," Caleb said, sitting stiff and angry in the small police office, his cap turned over and over in his hands, the knuckles white where he gripped it. "My father drowned off Pentreath Point in 1944, going out in weather no sane man would have chanced, and there's them in this village still say it weren't an accident, that he owed money he couldn't pay and chose his own way out rather than face it, leaving my mother, with 5 of us to raise on nothing but a widow's pension. I'll not have a stranger come digging through that grief for sport, asking me did my father have debts, did he have enemies, was there talk before he died of him going away somewhere and starting fresh, as if my father were the kind of man to abandon his own children. I told him to leave my family be, that's all. I never laid a hand on him beyond what you saw, and what you saw was a man defending his father's memory, not a murderer, whatever the gossips are saying over their cider. It was, Constable Polkinghorne privately conceded, a reasonable enough account, delivered with a conviction that carried, to his own ear at least, the unmistakable ring of truth, and there was no evidence, none whatsoever, placing Caleb anywhere near the mill pond that evening. Indeed, his sister Morwenna swore he had walked her home directly from the fair and remained at their cottage the whole evening, mending nets by the fire. But reasonable accounts had a way of being overshadowed, in a small community, by the simpler and more satisfying narrative of the angry fisherman who'd been seen threatening the victim hours before his death, and Caleb found himself, over the following days, the subject of glances in the street that he was too proud to acknowledge and too hurt to ignore, glances that followed him from the harbour to the chandler's and back again. Miss Marple, hearing the full account of the questioning from her niece, who had it in turn from the constable's own mother, who cleaned for the vicarage and was related by marriage to half the parish, that network of kinship and gossip that ran beneath every Cornish village like roots beneath a hedge, found herself dwelling not on Caleb's anger, which seemed to her entirely natural and rather touching in its filial loyalty, but on one particular detail of his account. Was there talk before he died of him going away somewhere and starting fresh? Now that, she murmured to herself, looking out at the grey October sea from the cottage window, the words turning over slowly in her mind, like a stone worried smooth by water, is interesting indeed. Renshaw was not merely investigating a single secret. He was testing a pattern, asking the same question, in different forms, of every family in this village that has lost a man to that sea or to that war, without ever quite being certain the loss was final. Chapter 6. Tea at the Vicarage. Miss Marple had long ago discovered that there was no surer way of learning the private business of a village than to be invited to tea by its vicar, and so it was with no great surprise and a good deal of quiet satisfaction that she found herself, the following Sunday afternoon, seated in the vicarage drawing-room with Reverend Hugh Tremaine and a plate of seed cake between them, the fire crackling, and a marmalade cat asleep on the hearthrug. The Reverend was, by all accounts, a good man, conscientious in his duties, gentle with the bereaved, firm but kind with the village children who tested his patience in Sunday school. He had come to Pentreth-on-Sea in 1946, in the first wave of clergy reassigned after the war, and had served the parish faithfully for 6 years, by which point most of the village had come to regard him as simply theirs, in the comfortable way that small communities absorb their long-standing clergy into the fabric of the place itself, so thoroughly that few could now quite picture the church without him in its pulpit. "A terrible business," he said now, stirring his tea with more force than the action strictly required, the spoon clinking against china. "Terrible. One doesn't expect such things here. Pentreth has always been, well, a quiet sort of place. We have our small dramas, our quarrels over hedgerows and church funds, but not this." "It does seem to have been remarkably quiet," Miss Marple agreed, "until Mr. Renshaw's arrival." She accepted a slice of cake with a small smile of thanks, settling it carefully upon her plate. "Tell me, Reverend, did he call upon you at all during his stay? I understood he was making something of a study of the parish, its old families, its history. A flicker, brief, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple had spent 70 years learning to catch exactly such flickers, the way a fisherman learns to read the smallest disturbance on the surface of the water, passed across the vicar's face. He did call, yes. Asked to see the parish registers. Births, marriages, deaths, that sort of thing. Going back through the war years particularly. I saw no harm in it. Many visitors take an interest in local history. We get them now and again, antiquarians and the like. And did he find what he was looking for? I couldn't say. I left him to it for the better part of an hour, while I attended to other duties. There was a sick parishioner to visit, and the choir needed sorting for evensong. The Reverend's smile was pleasant, practised, the smile of a man who had delivered a great many sermons and knew precisely how to hold one's expression steady under scrutiny, though his fingers, Miss Marple noted, had tightened very slightly around the handle of his cup. When I returned, he thanked me and left, seeming satisfied enough. I thought nothing further of it, until he gestured vaguely, the gesture encompassing the mill pond, the inquest, the whole unhappy business, his hand falling back to his lap. Miss Marple let a small silence settle, the kind of silence she had found, over many years, tended to draw out of people more than direct questioning ever could, a silence into which the uncomfortable feel compelled to pour some further explanation, if only to fill it. "It is curious," she said at last, almost to herself, gazing into the fire rather than at her host, "how a parish register might hold so very much information about a person, and how very little it can tell us, sometimes, about who a person has become, as opposed to who they once were, or who the record claims them to be. A name in a register is such a fragile thing, when one stops to consider it. A few words of copperplate, easily mistaken, easily, though I should not like to think it often happens, easily borrowed. The Reverend's hand lifting his teacup was, Miss Marple noted, with the detached interest of an entomologist observing an insect she had long suspected might sting, not quite steady, the china rattling faintly against its saucer. "I'm not sure I follow you, Miss Marple. "Oh, I am not at all sure I follow myself," she said comfortably, reaching for another slice of cake as though the matter were of no consequence whatsoever. An old woman's idle musing, nothing more. "This is excellent cake, Reverend. Did Mrs. Hoskins make it? I must ask her for the recipe. There is something in the spicing I cannot quite place." And the conversation moved, with every appearance of naturalness, to matters of baking, and the autumn flower show, and whether the church roof would survive another winter without repair, and if Miss Marple's eyes lingered, just once more, on the vicar's hands as he set down his cup, hands that had, she thought, the particular tension of a man holding himself very carefully together. She gave no further sign of it, and took her leave 20 minutes later, with thanks for a delightful afternoon. Chapter 7. Mrs. Pencarrow's Confession. It was Diana Whitcomb who arranged the meeting with Clarissa Pencarrow on the pretext of a charitable committee that did not, strictly speaking, require Miss Marple's attendance, but which Diana judged her aunt would find a useful opportunity nonetheless, having mentioned, with studied casualness, that Mrs. Pencarrow had seemed rather low since the harvest fair. Mrs. Pencarrow received them in the long drawing-room of the grey house on the headland, a room full of good furniture gone slightly shabby with age, the brocade on the chairs worn pale along the arms, the carpet faded where the autumn sun struck it each afternoon, and a view of the sea that no amount of fading upholstery could diminish, the water visible through tall windows stretching grey and restless to the horizon. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 60, dressed with the particular care of someone who had once been very beautiful and had not entirely relinquished the habit, and she poured tea with hands that, Miss Marple observed, trembled very slightly as the pot tilted. The committee business, concerning the Christmas bazaar, and whether the proceeds ought to go toward the church roof or the almshouses, a question debated with more heat than its substance perhaps warranted, was dispatched in 20 minutes. It was afterward, as Diana excused herself to admire the garden, murmuring something about the late roses, and left the two older women alone with the teapot between them, that Miss Marple turned the conversation, gently but with evident purpose, toward the matter that lay beneath all conversations in the village just now. "You spoke with Mr. Renshaw at the fair, I believe," she said, her voice carrying nothing more than mild, friendly interest. "I happened to be sitting nearby. You seemed, forgive me for saying so, rather distressed by whatever passed between you." Mrs. Pencarrow's composure, which had held admirably through the bazaar discussion, cracked all at once, like ice giving way beneath a careless step, the teacup rattling down into its saucer with a sound too loud for the quiet room. "He knew about Geoffrey," she said, and her voice, when it came, was small and frightened, in a way that did not at all suit the grandeur of the room around her, the painted family portraits, looking down from the walls upon a woman considerably diminished from the bright, composed hostess of 20 minutes before. "My husband. Everyone in the village believes he died in 1943, lost at sea when his ship went down off Malta. That is what I have told them for 9 years. That is what I told myself, for a great while, because it was easier than the truth, and because grief, Miss Marple, however terrible, is at least a thing one can learn to carry." The truth was a great deal heavier. "And the truth, Mrs. Pencarrow." Miss Marple's voice was very gentle. "The truth is that Geoffrey did not die at sea. He deserted, Miss Marple. He could not face going back to his unit after things he saw, things he never spoke of even to me, not properly, not in any words I could make sense of. He made his way home in secret, half out of his mind with it, and I hid him, here, in this house, in the old nursery at the top of the stairs where no servant had cause to go, for the better part of a year, terrified every day that someone would discover him and he would be shot for a coward, though God knows he was the bravest man I ever knew, to have endured what he endured and simply broken, the way a person can break, the way a bone breaks under a weight it was never built to carry. And then one night he left, took what money there was and went, and I never saw him again, and when the official notice came that he was presumed lost at sea, I let it stand. I let everyone believe it. It was kinder, to him and to me both, than the truth, and I have told myself that lie so many times these 9 years that I had very nearly come to believe it myself. She pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, the lace of it trembling, and Miss Marple, watching her with great compassion and no diminishment whatsoever of her careful attention, asked, very gently, "And this is what Mr. Renshaw knew? He said he was looking into cases of men who had taken new lives for themselves after the war, men who had, in his words, borrowed the names of the dead. He asked whether I had heard from Geoffrey since, whether I knew where he might be living now, under what name, whether I had ever had reason to believe he might have settled somewhere nearby, even under another identity entirely. I told him I did not know, which was the truth. I have not known, not for 9 years, and some nights I do not even know whether I wish to, whether finding him now would be a mercy or simply a fresh wound reopened." She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but steady now, meeting Miss Marple's gaze directly for the first time. "I did not kill that man, Miss Marple, if that is what you are circling toward with such patience, such careful, gentle patience that I find I cannot even resent it. I had no cause to. He was not threatening me. He made that quite plain. Said my own history was a private sorrow, and none of his proper business, beyond what light it might shed on his true inquiry. He was searching for someone else, for Geoffrey perhaps, or for a man very like him. I was only a piece in whatever puzzle he was assembling, and a piece, moreover, that told him nothing he did not already half suspect." Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment, the teacup cooling, untouched in her hand, the fire popping softly in the grate. "A man like Geoffrey," she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Yes. I think that may be precisely the matter, Mrs. Pencarrow, not your husband at all, for if Mr. Renshaw was indeed satisfied that you knew nothing further, then his search continued elsewhere, but a man very much like him, a man who came home from that same war, broken in a similar fashion, and found, in the chaos of it, an opportunity that your own husband never took, not merely to vanish, but to become someone else entirely." Chapter 8. The Doctor's Discomfort. If Mrs. Pencarrow's grief had been freely, almost gratefully, unburdened once given the smallest opening, Dr. Alistair Conway proved a considerably more difficult subject, guarded in a manner that interested Miss Marple a very great deal. Miss Marple contrived to meet him under the most natural of circumstances. A complaint, entirely genuine, of stiffness in her left shoulder that she had been meaning to have looked at for some weeks, the ache having grown noticeably worse with the autumn damp, and found the doctor's surgery a model of brisk professional efficiency, every instrument in its place, every certificate upon the wall precisely level, the whole room possessed of the particular, almost defensive tidiness of a man who liked everything accounted for and nothing left to chance. "Rheumatism, most likely," Dr. Conway said, after a brief examination, his fingers probing with professional gentleness at her shoulder. "Though at your age, Miss Marple, one ought not to entirely rule out, well, nothing alarming, I think. I'll give you something for the discomfort, a liniment, and you might consider a hot water bottle of an evening." "You're very thorough, Dr. Conway," said Miss Marple, settling her cardigan back onto her shoulder. "The village is fortunate in its physician. I understand you took over from Dr. Pelham, 6 years ago now? 7, this past spring." He was writing on a prescription pad, not looking up, his pen moving in quick, efficient strokes. "Dr. Pelham retired to Devon, gone to live near his daughter. I came down from Bristol. And before Bristol—" The pen paused, very briefly, over the paper, a hesitation no longer than a single held breath. But Miss Marple, watching with the patient attention of a woman who had spent a lifetime cataloguing exactly such hesitations, did not miss it. "London, originally. "Why do you ask, Miss Marple?" His tone had cooled by several careful degrees. "Oh, no particular reason." She folded her hands in her lap with the air of a woman entirely without ulterior motive, her expression mild and faintly apologetic, as though she sensed she had perhaps overstepped some small social boundary and wished to smooth it over. "Only that Mr. Renshaw seemed to take such an interest in you at the fair, and I confess I have grown rather curious about what subject could have occupied two strangers in such evidently absorbing conversation on so brief an acquaintance." Dr. Conway set down the pen with a small, deliberate click against the desk. "He asked about my medical training," he said, after a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds too long for comfort, his sandy brows drawing together. "Where I had qualified, when, under whom." I found it an odd line of questioning from a man I'd never met, but visitors are often curious about the village doctor, I find. There's a certain romance, I suppose, to the idea of a country practice, the dedicated young physician burying himself away from the city. Half my patients ask me the same things eventually. "And did you satisfy his curiosity?" "As much as I cared to. I am not in the habit, Miss Marple, of discussing my professional history in great detail with strangers who have no evident right to ask after it, however charming their manner of asking." There was an edge in his voice now, carefully controlled but unmistakably present, the brisk professional veneer, thinning just perceptibly. "If you'll forgive me for saying so, I find this entire line of conversation rather presumptuous, coming as it does so soon after a man's death and an inquest already concluded. I am sorry the man drowned, genuinely sorry, whatever you may suspect. I examined his body and signed the certificate and gave my evidence to the coroner, fully and honestly, and I do not see what further interest I can be expected to take in the matter, nor what business it is of mine, or yours, where I trained, or under whom." It was, Miss Marple reflected as she walked home along the harbour wall a little later, the wind off the sea pulling at her hat, a perfectly reasonable objection, delivered by a perfectly reasonable man, with every appearance of simple professional pride, wounded by impertinent questioning. And yet she had observed, in her examination, a curious thing, that Dr. Conway's hands, so steady throughout her shoulder, so confident in their probing and their diagnosis, had not been steady at all when he wrote the prescription afterward, the letters of his own signature coming out cramped and uncertain, quite unlike the confident hand she had glimpsed on the surgery's certificates, framed proudly upon the wall, each one bearing the same neat, flowing signature, A. J. Conway, M.D. A signature, she thought, that a man writes 1,000 times in the course of his daily work ought never to falter, however irritated its owner might be, unless, perhaps, the hand that wrote it had not always been quite so practised in forming those particular letters, that particular name. She thought of this for a long while, turning it over as one turns over a shell on the beach, looking for the particular pattern that distinguishes it from every other shell of its general kind, and resolved to make discreet inquiries, when opportunity allowed, into the medical register itself. Chapter 9. What the postmistress remembered. It was in the post office, 3 days later, the bell above the door jingling as Miss Marple entered out of a fine, persistent drizzle, that the next thread presented itself, offered up, as so much village information was, without the giver having the least idea of its significance. Miss Marple had gone in to post a letter to her nephew Raymond, and fell, as one inevitably did, into conversation with Mrs. Hannaford, the postmistress, a woman whose memory for the small transactions of village life was encyclopedic, and whose discretion was, charitably speaking, variable, particularly where a sympathetic listener could be found. "Terrible thing about Mr. Renshaw," Mrs. Hannaford said, weighing the letter with practised hands, the brass scales pointer trembling and settling. "He was in here that very morning, you know, the morning of the fair, asking could he send a telegram, urgent, to London." Miss Marple's interest, though carefully concealed behind an expression of mild, attentive politeness, sharpened considerably. "Did he indeed? Do you recall what it said?" "I should not wish to pry into a private matter, of course, but the poor man's death has rather thrown the whole village into such confusion." "Oh, I shouldn't repeat the contents of a private telegram, Miss Marple. Not as a rule, more than my position's worth." Mrs. Hannaford lowered her voice nonetheless, leaning across the counter in the manner of one about to do precisely the thing she had just disclaimed, her eyes bright with the pleasure of being asked. "Though I will say it was short, something like, 'Confirmed. Will telephone upon return. Proceed with caution regarding the legal position. Signed Renshaw. Addressed to a Mr. Carruthers at a solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn, London.' I remember on account of it cost him a deal more than the usual, sending it express the way he did." "Confirmed," Miss Marple repeated softly, the word settling into place among the others she had already gathered, like a key tried carefully against a lock. "How very interesting. Confirmed what, I wonder? I couldn't say, I'm sure. But he seemed in a great hurry about it, wanted it sent immediate, paid extra for the express service, which we don't get much call for out here, as you can imagine, mostly being birthday wishes and the odd business letter that could just as well wait a day." Mrs. Hannaford handed over the change for Miss Marple's own letter, counting it carefully into her palm. "And then that very evening, poor man, drowned in the mill pond. Gives one quite a turn, doesn't it, to think he sent off his last message that very morning, and never knew it would be his last. Never knew when he handed it over the counter to me that he'd not live to see the answer." Miss Marple thanked her and walked out into the grey October street with the particular stillness of mind that came over her when a great many small, disconnected observations began, very quietly, to arrange themselves into a pattern, the way scattered pieces of a jigsaw, turned over one by one, suddenly reveal an edge, a corner, a place where two pieces fit, confirmed, not suspected, not, I believe, upon reflection. Renshaw had gone to the fair that afternoon already certain of his conclusion, and had spent the day, she now understood, not investigating but confirming, testing his certainty against the reactions of the people he had already, before ever setting foot in Pentreath-on-Sea, identified as relevant to his inquiry: the widow, the fisherman's son, the doctor, and, she did not doubt it now, the vicar himself. Which meant that whatever Renshaw had discovered, he had discovered it before he arrived. In records obtained elsewhere, perhaps, in London, through this Mr. Carruthers and his solicitor's office, long before he ever telephoned ahead to Blackberry Inn for a room above the Snug. And someone, watching him conduct that final verification at the fair, had understood precisely what he was doing, had perhaps even overheard, in some unguarded moment, the word confirmed fall from his own lips, and had understood, too, that a telegram already sent to London meant there was very little time left in which to act, that whatever protection silence might once have offered had, in the space of a single morning, ceased entirely to exist. Chapter 10. The Gardener's Boy. It was young Tommy Pencarrow, no relation to Clarissa Pencarrow of the Grey House, the name being a common enough one in those parts, scattered through the parish registers in a dozen unconnected branches, who provided, quite by accident, the detail that would in time prove most decisive of all. Tommy was 11, the son of the inn's gardener, and had been sent by his father to fetch tools from the shed nearest the mill pond, on the afternoon of the fair, some hours before Renshaw's body was found, the boy grumbling under his breath the whole way at being made to miss the toffee apples for the sake of a spade and a pair of shears. Miss Marple, who had taken to walking that stretch of the lane each afternoon on the pretext of admiring what remained of the autumn flowers, a pretext that fooled no one in the village, though all were too polite, or too fond of her, to say so directly, encountered the boy quite by chance, gathering blackberries from the hedge that gave the inn its name. His fingers stained purple to the knuckle, and fell into the kind of easy, unthreatening conversation that children, she had always found, responded to far more honestly than adults ever did, having not yet learned the adult habit of weighing each word for its possible consequence. "I saw the gentleman who drowned," Tommy volunteered, between blackberries, with the slightly ghoulish pride of a child who has brushed close to tragedy and wishes the fact properly acknowledged by an interested adult. "That afternoon, before the fair ended." "Did you indeed? Where was this, Tommy?" Miss Marple kept her voice light, conversational, betraying nothing of the attention now fully engaged behind it. "By the mill gate. He wasn't alone, neither." The boy popped another blackberry into his mouth, entirely unaware of the weight his next words would carry, his attention only half on the conversation and half on the hedge. "There was someone with him, talking ever so quiet, the both of them, like they didn't want no one to hear. Made me think of when Mam and Dad are having words and stop sudden if I come in the room. Could you see who it was?" Tommy frowned, working at the memory with the particular effort children bring to recollections they had not, at the time, considered important enough to fix properly in mind. "Not proper, no. Had their back to me, mostly, and I weren't looking long. Dad wanted them tools sharpish, said I'd dawdled enough already." He scratched his nose, leaving a faint purple smear. "But I'll tell you what I did see." He looked up at her, pleased with himself, the way children are pleased to have remembered something an adult finds interesting. Whoever it was had a coat the same colour as the Reverend's. That dark green one he wears of a Sunday, when it's cold, with the big collar. I remember on account of I thought, that's funny, the vicar talking to the stranger out here by the mill, stead of up at the church where he usually is on a Saturday, seeing to the flowers for Sunday. Miss Marple felt the small, cold thrill of a piece finally, irrevocably falling into place, though she gave no outward sign of it beyond a faint, thoughtful stillness. "Tommy," she said carefully, "did you tell this to Constable Polkinghorne when he came asking about that afternoon?" "Wasn't asked, miss. He only wanted to know had I seen anyone falling in the pond, or anyone acting queer-like near the water, and I hadn't, on account of I'd gone home with the tools by then, long before dark." He shrugged, with the magnificent unconcern of a child for whom this was simply one fact among the day's many facts. Blackberries, tools, a stranger by the mill gate, a scolding from his father for dawdling, none of them weighted any differently from the others, in his own private accounting of the day. But Miss Marple, walking back toward the cottage with her basket of late blackberries, the light already beginning its early autumn fade, understood very well that this particular fact carried a weight altogether different from the rest, and that the time had come to look very much more closely indeed, and very much more carefully, at the Reverend Hugh Tremaine. Chapter 11. A Visit to the Registers. It took Miss Marple very little persuasion, a mild fiction about researching her own family's Cornish connections, several branches of which had, she explained with perfect truthfulness, indeed settled in the county some generations back, a request made with such gentle, unthreatening interest that no one could have suspected its true purpose, to gain a second, more careful look at the parish registers Renshaw himself had consulted some weeks before. The Reverend occupied that afternoon with a confirmation class in the church itself, the sound of young voices reciting catechism drifting faintly through the vestry door, had left the vestry unattended, and it was the verger, Mr. Hoskins, Mrs. Hoskins's husband, and quite as unsuspecting as his wife's seed cake had been delicious, who showed Miss Marple to the great leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked with age, and left her to her researches with no thought whatsoever that anything beyond genealogical curiosity might be at stake, returning to his own work polishing the brass. It did not take her long. The Register of Deaths for 1944 contained, among the parish's wartime losses, a list longer, she noted with a private pang, than any small village ought to have had to bear. The burial entry, body not recovered, presumed drowned, service held in absentia, of a young curate named Hugh Tremaine, aged 26, lost in a boating accident off the Cornish coast while serving, before his ordination was complete, as a chaplain's assistant attached to a coastal unit stationed some 40 miles from where Miss Marple now sat. The entry was brief, formal, signed by the then incumbent vicar, long since dead himself, and buried, she noted, in the very churchyard outside. But it was the date that caught and held Miss Marple's careful attention, her finger resting upon the faded ink. For the present, Reverend Hugh Tremaine had, by his own account given many times from the pulpit, in sermons recalling his own calling to the cloth, been ordained in 1945 and had served 2 small parishes in the Midlands before coming to Pentreth-on-Sea in 1946. A man cannot be drowned off the Cornish coast in 1944 and ordained, in his own person, in the Midlands the following year. The arithmetic of it simply would not hold. Unless, of course, the man drowned in 1944 and the man ordained in 1945 were not, in fact, the same man at all, but 2 men, bound by circumstance and proximity, and perhaps even genuine affection, who had, by some terrible accident of war, come to share a single name, one of them living on in borrowed papers, while the other lay forgotten beneath the cold Cornish water that had first taken him. Miss Marple closed the register very gently, her hands quite steady, though her heart, she would have admitted only to herself, was not, and sat for a long while in the cool, dim quiet of the vestry, the catechism still murmuring faintly beyond the door, thinking not of triumph, but of a deep and sorrowing pity for whatever desperate circumstance had driven a man to such a choice, and a colder, more urgent concern for what that man might now feel compelled to do, with Victor Renshaw's confirmed suspicions already winging their way to a solicitor's office in London, and very little time remaining before the truth, whatever its exact shape, broke over Pentreth-on-Sea, like the storm that had brought Renshaw to its shores in the first place. Chapter 12. The Second Death. It was Diana Whitcomb who brought the news the following morning, white-faced, before Miss Marple had so much as finished her tea, bursting into the small dining room with the newspaper still folded under her arm. "Aunt Jane, it's Mr. Carruthers, the solicitor in London, the one Renshaw telegraphed. He's dead. It was on the wireless this morning, found in his chambers, a fall down the stairs, they're saying, though the announcer made it sound rather more uncertain than that, mentioning the police were making inquiries, which never sounds quite like an accident to me. And Aunt Jane, he died the night before last, the very night the Reverend was reported to have gone up to London on diocesan business. Do you remember, he mentioned it after the morning service, said he'd be back by Sunday." Miss Marple set down her cup with great care, her face, for once, entirely without its usual composure, the colour draining slightly from it. "Then we have very little time indeed," she said, "before whatever evidence Mr. Carruthers held in his keeping is lost beyond recovery, and before someone in this village realises that I, too, have begun to ask the sort of questions Mr. Renshaw was asking, and concludes that an old woman's curiosity may prove every bit as dangerous as a stranger's." It was a measure of the gravity Miss Marple attached to this realisation that she went, within the hour, directly to Constable Polkinghorne, not with accusation, for she had not yet sufficient proof to offer one, and accusation without proof, she well knew, could do as much harm as good, but with a request that he telegraph Truro at once regarding the precise circumstances of a London solicitor's death, and that he make discreet inquiry as to whether the Reverend Hugh Tremaine's whereabouts on the night in question could be verified by anyone beyond his own account. "You're not seriously suggesting, Miss Marple," said Polkinghorne, his weathered young face creased with genuine disbelief, "that the vicar of this parish, a man who buried my own father not 2 years past with more kindness than I'd any right to expect—" "I am suggesting nothing at all, Constable, beyond the wisdom of verification," she said gently, but with an unmistakable firmness beneath the gentleness. "A man's whereabouts on a particular night are either verifiable or they are not, and there is no harm whatsoever in establishing which, before matters proceed any further, whoever that man may be. I would also ask, and I do, ask it most earnestly, Constable, for I believe a great deal may depend upon it, that no word of this inquiry reach the Reverend himself before you have your answer. A man with something to protect, who learns that the net is closing about him, may do something considerably more desperate than he has done already, and I should not like to think that our caution had cost another life. Polkinghorne, to his credit, did not dismiss her outright. Miss Marple's reputation, quietly earned over several previous matters in neighbouring parishes, had preceded her even here, whispered of with a respect that bordered on awe among the county's younger constables. And the telegrams went out that same afternoon, Polkinghorne himself cycling to the telegraph office, rather than trust the matter to anyone else. The answer, when it came the following day, was unequivocal. No diocesan meeting of the kind the Reverend claimed had been scheduled for that date, nothing recorded at the bishop's office, no colleague able to confirm his presence at any gathering whatsoever, no record of his presence at the diocesan offices at all, nor at the lodging-house where visiting clergy customarily stayed. The Reverend Hugh Tremaine had lied about where he had been on the night Mr. Carruthers died, and Miss Marple, reading the telegram's careful officialese, felt the last small doubt she had permitted herself dissolve entirely away. Chapter 13. Miss Marple's Question. She chose to approach him alone, in the end, against the urging of her niece, and the rather more forceful urging of Constable Polkinghorne, who wished to accompany her, and was firmly, gently, but absolutely refused, a refusal he accepted only after she had explained her reasoning, with patient and considerable insistence. A man cornered by the law will say nothing at all, Constable, beyond what his solicitor advises him, and rightly so. It is what the law is for, she told him, standing at the lich gate with the evening already drawing in. A man approached by an old woman, with nothing more threatening than the prospect of a teacup, may, out of simple human exhaustion, out of the sheer relief of finally setting down a weight he has carried alone for 8 long years, say rather more than he intends. I have found this, over a great many years and a great many such conversations, to be reliably true, and I do not believe Reverend Tremaine, whatever else he may have done, poses any physical danger to a harmless old woman who comes to him in the spirit of compassion rather than accusation. She found him in the church itself, late in the afternoon, alone among the pews, the confirmation class long since dismissed, the autumn light coming golden dim through the west window and laying long bars of colour across the stone floor, and he looked up at her approach with an expression that told her, before she had spoken a single word, that he already understood why she had come, that some part of him, perhaps, had been waiting for this very moment, since the night by the mill-pond. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the church's stillness, "I rather thought it might be you. May I sit, Reverend?" He gestured to the pew beside him, and for a long moment neither spoke, the silence of the empty church settling around them like dust motes drifting in the slanted light, the only sound the faint creak of old timber settling somewhere overhead. "I am not going to pretend I don't understand your purpose here," he said at last, his hands folded very still in his lap. "You've been to the registers. I saw the ledger had been moved from where Hoskins always leaves it, the corner just slightly out of true. Small things, Miss Marple, but I have learned, this past fortnight, to notice small things myself, having so much cause to fear what they might reveal." "I have," she said simply, "and I think, Reverend, though I shall call you that, for I do not know what other name to use, nor do I think it matters greatly now, whatever name you carry forward from this, I think you owe it to yourself, if to no one else, to tell me the truth of what happened, not because I demand it, for I have no authority to demand anything of you, because I believe you are a man who has carried something very heavy for a very long time, and that the carrying of it has cost you more than anyone in this parish has ever understood, and because a confession given freely, reverend, however terrible its contents, is always a lighter thing to carry to one's own reckoning than a truth dragged unwillingly into the light. He was silent for a long moment, his hands, those same hands that had, Miss Marple now understood, never quite managed to hold steady under close examination, that had trembled over the teacup and the seed cake and the small courtesies of an ordinary Sunday afternoon, pressed flat against his knees, as though by main force of will he could hold the whole of himself together a little longer. "I was not always Hugh Tremaine," he said finally, very quietly, the words coming slow and halting, as though each one had to be pulled up from some great depth. "My name, my true name, was Edward Voss. I served alongside the real Hugh Tremaine in 1944 as part of a coastal chaplaincy unit. We were close, closer than brothers, I sometimes thought, in the particular way men become close when they have shared the worst of what war can offer, and found, against all reason, that the sharing of it made the unbearable almost bearable. He was training for ordination, had been since before the war, interrupted only by the fighting. I was nothing really. A clerk before the war, no family left to speak of after it. My own people lost to the bombing in 41. No faith of my own, beyond what I'd absorbed from watching him minister to dying men with more grace and steadiness than I have ever managed in my life since, in any capacity. And then he drowned, said Miss Marple gently. And then he drowned. A boating accident, exactly as the register records. I was there, in the boat beside his. I tried to save him. The water was so cold and the current so much stronger than either of us had reckoned, and I could not save him, and his body was never recovered, never given so much as a proper grave for his sister to visit, only that bare entry in a register, body not recovered. He laughed, a small, terrible sound with no humour in it at all, more breath than laughter. And in the chaos that followed, the unit reassigned within the week, records in disarray, half of London still burning some nights from the doodlebugs. No one with leisure or inclination to chase down the precise particulars of one drowned chaplain's assistant. I found I held his papers, his ordination correspondence still in progress, his personal effects, his identity, in every official sense that mattered to the bureaucracy of a country at war and exhausted by it. "And you took it," said Miss Marple, not as accusation, but simply as the next fact in a chain she had already, in large part, assembled. "I had no one, Miss Marple, no family to grieve me if Edward Voss simply vanished from the record. No wife, no children, nothing waiting for me on the other side of that war, but an empty room in a bombed-out street, and the prospect of beginning again, entirely alone, with nothing. And Hugh had spoken so often, so passionately, in those long cold nights when sleep would not come, of the parish he hoped to serve, the good he hoped to do, the particular vision he held of a quiet country living, where he might do real, patient, unspectacular good among ordinary people. It seemed, in the madness of that time, almost a mercy, to let his calling continue, through me, rather than let it die with him, in that cold water, forgotten, his ambitions drowned alongside his body. I completed his ordination training under his name, in a different diocese where no one had known either of us before, where the disruption of the war years made such gaps in record-keeping almost commonplace. I have served this parish for 6 years, faithfully, I believe, with my whole heart given to it, and I have done in his name every good thing I have ever managed to do in my entire life, Miss Marple, every single one. And Mr. Renshaw discovered this. He had known Hugh too, slightly, before the war, through some family connection I never fully understood, a cousin of a cousin, that sort of distant acquaintance. He'd heard, somehow, rumours that troubled him over the years, a discrepancy in dates perhaps, mentioned in passing by someone who had known the real Tremaine, or simply an old soldier's instinct, that something did not quite add up when he encountered my name in some parish circular or other. He came here to confirm it, and confirm it he did, through the registers, through careful questioning of villagers who'd known me only 6 years, against a man whose own family believed him dead these 8, and he told me so himself, that evening by the mill gate, with what he no doubt believed was Christian kindness, that he would give me the chance to confess it myself, to the bishop, before he was obliged to report it to the proper authorities. He spoke of Hugh's family, you understand, a sister, still living in Shropshire, who had been told her brother died in 1944, and never knew that a stranger had, in some sense, gone on living his life for him these 8 years since, never knew there might be a grave to properly mark, a true account to finally be given. And you could not let him make that report. The Reverend Edward Voss closed his eyes, his face, in the failing gold light, suddenly looking very much older than it had a moment before. I do not remember deciding to kill him, Miss Marple. I want you to understand that, though I do not expect you to believe it, nor do I particularly deserve your belief after what I have done, I remember only a kind of falling, a terror so absolute it felt almost like drowning myself, the same cold black water closing over my head as it had closed over Hugh's 8 years before, as though the sea had only been waiting all this time to finish what it started. We argued by the gate, and he turned to walk back toward the inn, satisfied, I think, that he had said his piece and given me my chance, and I followed, still pleading with him, and somewhere along that dark path by the pond I struck him. I don't even recall picking up the stone, only that it was in my hand, and then it was not, and he had fallen, and the water— He stopped, his voice breaking entirely for the first time. I held him under. I want that recorded honestly, whatever else is recorded, however much easier it might be to let it stand as a simple, panicked blow followed by accident. I did not simply fail to save a man who had struck his head by accident. I held him under the water with my own 2 hands until I was certain, and then I went home and I conducted evensong 3 hours later, with a steadiness that frightens me still, when I think of it, frightens me more than the act itself. And Mr. Carruthers? Renshaw's solicitor. He held documents Renshaw had lodged with him before ever coming to Cornwall, evidence enough to expose me beyond any possibility of denial, copies of the original registers, correspondence with the real Tremain's old commanding officer, the whole sorry architecture of proof. I learned of his existence from the telegram. I confess I went to the post office myself the next morning on the pretext of posting parish correspondence, and Mrs. Hannaford, who tells everyone everything without quite meaning any harm by it, told me without my even properly needing to ask, simply in the ordinary course of village chatter. I went to London on the Friday. I told Carruthers I represented the family, that I needed to review the papers before any action was taken regarding what remained of the estate, that there were sensitivities to be considered. He believed me. Why should he not? I am a man of the cloth, after all, or so my papers attest, and I have spent 8 years learning to wear that authority as naturally as my own skin. The bitterness in his voice was its own kind of confession, sharper than anything that had come before. He would not let the documents leave his possession, insisted they must remain with him pending instruction from his own client's executors. So there was a staircase, Miss Marple, steep, poorly lit, the carpet worn at the edge of the 3rd step from the top. I noticed that even as I did not plan it, any more than I planned the mill gate, though I cannot pretend now that the not planning makes it any less my own hand that did it. I have simply discovered, this past month, that I am capable of things I would never, in 6 years of preaching mercy and patience and the forgiveness of sins from that very pulpit there, have believed myself capable of. The church was very quiet. Outside, the gulls cried over the harbour, distant and indifferent, and the last of the gold light was fading from the west window into the grey of an ordinary October evening, the colours draining slowly from the stone floor, as though the church itself were settling into mourning. "I am tired, Miss Marple," he said at last, very simply. all the careful clerical composure gone out of him entirely, leaving only a tired, frightened man in a borrowed collar. I have been tired, I think, for 8 years, carrying a dead man's name like a stone I could never quite set down, never quite allowed myself to rest from carrying. I find, now that it is over, now that I have said it all aloud at last to another living soul, that I am almost relieved, which frightens me nearly as much as anything else I have told you this evening. Chapter 14. The Reckoning Constable Polkinghorne, waiting discreetly at the lich gate as Miss Marple had arranged beforehand, his young face pale with the dread of what he half suspected he was about to hear, took the Reverend's confession, given freely, and repeated, with the same exhausted candour, before the sergeant who arrived from Truro within the hour, his account never once wavering or attempting to soften its own worst particulars, with a gravity that did nothing to disguise his own profound shock. The man he had known for 6 years as a gentle, conscientious vicar, who had confirmed him, who had buried his father with such evident and unfeigned compassion, was, in the space of a single autumn evening, revealed as something else entirely. A man named Edward Voss, who had committed 2 murders to protect a borrowed identity, and who surrendered himself, in the end, with no resistance at all, walking out to the waiting car between the 2 officers with the quiet, almost peaceful resignation of a man finally permitted to set down a burden he had carried far too long alone. The village received the news, when it broke the following morning, with the particular stunned quiet that follows a revelation no one had thought to imagine, however much they had speculated about murder these past 2 weeks, over their pints at the Anchor and their gossip across garden walls. Caleb Trewin, who had borne the weight of unspoken suspicion since the harvest fair, the sidelong glances and the half-finished sentences that stopped when he entered a room, found himself, in the days that followed, the recipient of a great many quiet apologies he accepted with more grace than the village, perhaps entirely deserved. His sister Morwenna, rather less forgiving on his behalf than he was himself. Dr. Conway's own evasiveness, it transpired upon Miss Marple's gentle and rather more sympathetic inquiry, concerned nothing more sinister than an old scandal regarding a failed first marriage in Bristol he had no wish to see discussed at the village fair. A private grief, entirely unconnected to Renshaw's true purpose, though Renshaw's broad, probing inquiries into discrepancies and hidden histories had alarmed Conway into evasion regardless. The doctor having spent some years carefully rebuilding a reputation he feared old gossip might unravel, and Clarissa Pencarrow, who had spent 9 years believing her husband's true fate to be the village's darkest possible secret, found that secret rendered, almost overnight, a minor and private sorrow beside the much larger one that had unfolded at the vicarage she had attended faithfully every Sunday of those same 9 years. The real Hugh Tremane's sister, traced through diocesan records within the week, a Miss Eleanor Tremaine now living quietly in Shropshire, was informed at last, 8 years late, but informed nonetheless, by a kind and careful letter Constable Polkinghorne himself helped draft, that her brother had not, as she had long believed, simply drowned and been buried at sea without ceremony or marker, but had drowned, been impersonated, and in some strange, terrible, tangled way had his memory both honoured and betrayed by the very man who took his name and carried his calling forward, however unlawfully, into 6 years of genuine parish service. She wept, the family solicitor reported back to the village in a letter Constable Polkinghorne read aloud, with quiet permission, to Miss Marple, for a very long time, though whether for grief renewed or grief finally permitted to properly conclude after 8 years of incomplete and unknowing mourning, no one in Pentreth-on-Sea could quite say, and perhaps, Miss Marple privately reflected, Miss Eleanor Tremaine herself could not entirely have said either. Chapter 15. What Remains in the Reeds. Miss Marple stayed in Pentreth-on-Sea a further fortnight before returning to St. Mary Mead, the chill she had come to recover from having long since lifted, replaced by the particular weariness that always followed, for her, the unmasking of a great unhappiness rather than any simple villainy, a weariness no quantity of sea air seemed quite able to dispel. She walked, on her final evening, down to the mill pond behind Blackberry Inn, where the reeds had begun to die back now with the deepening of the season, brown and brittle and bowing under a wind grown sharper with the turn toward winter, and stood for a while looking at the dark water that had taken two lives in such different ways. The real Hugh Tremaine, drowned by accident and the indifferent cruelty of war 8 years before, far from this particular pond, though bound to it nonetheless by the strange chain of consequence that had finally drawn them all together, and Victor Renshaw, drowned by a desperate man's hand in this same cold Cornish water that had first, by some terrible accident of timing and circumstance, made the deception possible in the first place. "It is a curious thing," she said to Diana, who had walked down with her, their breath visible now in the evening cold, "how very often it is not wickedness, precisely, that leads a person to murder, but rather an ordinary human frailty, fear, grief, the desperate wish to hold on to something one cannot bear to lose, whether that something be a man's life or a stolen vocation that has, against all reason, become entirely genuine in the living of it, that is permitted, by some terrible accident of circumstance, to grow until it can no longer be contained within the bounds of an ordinary conscience." Mr. Voss did not begin as a wicked man, Diana. I do not believe, even now, having heard his own account from his own lips, that he was ever truly a wicked man, in the sense the word usually carries, the sense of a man who delights in cruelty for its own sake. He was a frightened one, a grieving one, who made one understandable, even sympathetic choice in the chaos of a war that asked impossible things of everyone it touched, and then found himself trapped by that single choice for 8 long years, until trapped men, my dear, will very often do things that the same men, freed of their trap and given some gentler path, would find utterly unrecognizable in themselves, would scarcely believe themselves capable of. "Does that make it less terrible, Aunt Jane?" Diana asked, pulling her coat closer against the wind. "No," said Miss Marple, watching the last of the evening light fade slowly from the water, the surface gone the colour of pewter in the dusk. "It makes it, I think, very much sadder, which is not at all the same thing as less terrible, however much we might wish the two could simply cancel one another out. Sadness and terror, my dear, are very poor strangers to one another in this life. They generally arrive together, hand in hand, like two ill-matched travellers forced to share a single road, and they generally stay rather a long time once they have arrived, however much we might wish to see the back of either one." They turned, the two of them, and walked back up the darkening lane toward the warm lights of Blackberry Inn, where Beatrice Pendarves was even now laying the supper table, and Rosalind was drawing the curtains against the coming night, and the ordinary business of the village continued all around them, fires lit against the autumn chill, kettles set to boil, children called in from the gathering dark by mothers standing in lit doorways, continued, as it always did, as perhaps it always must, regardless of what truths had been uncovered in its midst, or what graves, old and new, true and false, lay quiet now beneath the Cornish soil and the indifferent, patient sea beyond it. Behind them, the mill pond settled into stillness, its reeds bending one last time in the dying wind, its secrets at last fully told. It was Diana, glancing back once over her shoulder at the dark water before the lane bent away toward the inn's welcoming lights, who asked the question that had, in truth, been sitting quietly at the back of her own mind for some days now, unasked, until this final evening made the asking feel, somehow, permissible. "What will become of the parish now, Aunt Jane? They will need a new vicar, I suppose, and the old one, Mr. Voss, will stand trial under a name that was never truly his to begin with, will be hanged, if it comes to that, or imprisoned, for the whole of his remaining life, under a name belonging to a man who has been dead these 8 years and more. It seems a strange sort of justice when one stops to consider it properly, that even his punishment must be administered to a borrowed identity. It is, I think, one of the saddest particulars of the entire affair, Miss Marple agreed, drawing her shawl more closely about her shoulders as the wind freshened off the sea. Though I understand the authorities mean to record the proceedings under his true name, Edward Voss. Once the formalities are settled, a small mercy perhaps, both to him and to the memory of the man whose name he wore so long, that the two might finally, at the last, be properly separated again in the eyes of the law, each given back his own history, however much that history must now include this terrible final chapter. As for the parish, I have no doubt the bishop will send a new man in due course, and the village will receive him kindly, as villages so often do, and in a year or two the children who are not yet born will grow up knowing nothing of any of this beyond what their elders choose, in quieter moments, to tell them. That is the way of these things, Diana. A village absorbs its tragedies the way the sea absorbs a stone thrown into it. There is a great splash, and rings spreading outward for a time, and then, eventually, only stillness again, though I should not like to suggest the stone itself is ever entirely forgotten by those who stood close enough to see it thrown. They walked on a little further in companionable silence, the lane narrowing as it climbed away from the water, until the lights of the inn showed warm and steady through the bare hedgerow ahead. "I confess," said Diana at last, "that I shall think rather differently of him now, whenever I happen to recall those 6 years of sermons, wondering, I suppose, how much of what he preached he came by honestly, in his own heart, and how much was borrowed along with the name and the collar. I should not trouble yourself overmuch with that particular question, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "for I think you will find, upon reflection, that it scarcely matters where a kindness is first learned, so long as it is afterward genuinely felt and genuinely given. Mr. Voss did a great deal of real good in this parish over 6 years, whatever falsehood lay beneath the collar he wore while doing it, and I do not think those years of patient, faithful service are entirely erased by what came after, however much the manner of their ending must colour how we remember them now. Human beings are rarely so simply sorted into the wholly good and the wholly wicked as we might wish them to be, Diana. It is, I have found, one of the very few certainties a long life leaves a person with." And with that, the two women walked the last short distance to the inn together, leaving the mill pond to its darkness and its silence behind them, the wind off the Atlantic carrying away, at last, whatever remained to be said. The end.